Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and today we want to talk about how America is so often, and it's not just America, but it's the example since it's where I live. It's so sometimes influenced by unjust laws. Um, you know, if a law is unjust, you have a right to say, no, this is not right. This is not how things should be. And don't get me wrong, I don't think we should go around being openly just flaunting laws, but there are some laws that are often uh, enforced that are, in a sense, just they shouldn't be laws. Like here, we've got some excerpts from Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail. Well, I'll read it because it's only 2-3 paragraphs. You express a great deal of anxiety over our willingness to break law. This is certainly a legitimate concern, since we do so diligently urge people to obey the Supreme Court's decision of 1954 outlawing segregation in public schools. It is rather strange and paradoxical to find us consciously breaking laws. One may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer is found in the fact that there are two types of laws. There are just laws and there are unjust laws. I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. One has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to obey unjust or disobey unjust laws. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregated a false sense of inferiority. Let us turn to a more concrete example of just and unjust laws. An unjust law is a code that a majority inflicts on a minority that is not binding on itself. This is difference made legal. On the other hand, a just law is a code that a majority compels a minority to follow that is willing to follow it, that they are willing to follow itself. This is sameness made legal. Let me give another part in enacting or creating because they did not have the unhampered right to vote. Who can say that the legislature of Alabama, which set up the segregation laws, was democratically elected? Throughout the state of Alabama, all types of convenient methods are used to prevent Negroes from becoming registered voters, and there are some counties without a single Negro registered to vote, despite the fact that the Negro constitutes a majority of the population. Can any law set up in such a state be considered democratically structured? There are some instances when a law is just on its face, but unjust in its application. For instance, I was arrested Friday on a charge of parading without a permit. Now, there is nothing wrong with an ordinance which requires a permit for a parade, but when the ordinance is used to preserve segregation and deny citizens the First Amendment privilege of peaceful assembly and peaceful protest, then it becomes unjust. I hope you can see the distinction I am trying to point out. In no sense do I advocate evading or defying the law as a rabid segregationist would do. This would lead to anarchy. One who breaks an unjust law must do it openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty. I submit that an individual who breaks the law, a law that conscience tells him is unjust, and willingly accepts the penalty by staying in jail to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice, is in reality expressing the very highest respect for the law. Now, if you want to, I also have this entire piece written by Dr. King in my papers and speeches book I read. So, but yeah, if you want to, you can look that up and watch it. But in this, Dr. King points out there are laws that are not, all laws are not created equal, I guess would be a good way to say this. Some are created to attack individuals and their rights, while others have viable reasons to exist. But even those with viable reasons can be used unjustly. Now, we still have laws that are unjust, that hurt people, that are created specifically to attack minority groups. The attacks on LGBTQ, the attacks on cross-dressing. That's just an example. There's leftover remnants from the laws that used to exist that still affect people, because even though many of those laws have been eradicated, the effects they created still exist, such as redlining, forcing many people of color into poorer neighborhoods, so that, you often saw many of white families and people move into the suburbs as, as part of the effect as well. So even though the laws themselves don't necessarily exist anymore, their actual effects still plague us as a society. And there are things we need to consciously do to fix such effects. Here, I've got a page up here that talks about 8 ways America's legal system punishes people who are poor. And again, this is Unjust Laws. Money bail. We currently have 2 justice systems, one for the rich and another for everybody else. You know, many Americans, they cannot afford $1,000. Some, most can't even afford, a bill in the hundreds. But you know who can afford such things? People of wealth. They don't have to be billionaires. Shoot, many of them don't have to be millionaires. They could be making, 100, 200,000 a year, 300,000 a year, because they'll have money and it's just like, all right, we've got no problem spending it. But, it's just used as a way to punish the poor. Because if they do something, even if there is a justified reason, they're not going to be able necessarily to afford bail. Many Americans won't be able to do that because they're not wealthy. Second, private bail companies. And to even add on to this same situation, there's companies that make money off this system. It's ridiculous. Those who cannot afford their full bail amount, often over 6 figures, must contract with a private bail company to pay 10%, which can be tens of thousands of dollars. So even if it's something that you're unjustly being accused of, you'll be punished for being poor. Because you won't necessarily be able to afford bail, even if you get in contact with a bail company, so they pay your bail and you have to pay them off like it would be for a credit card. It's ridiculous. It's an attack on the poor. Next, they got suspended driver's license. And I know there are some people who live in other countries and places that's like, well, that's not a big deal. In America, it is. Everything is so spread out. You have to have vehicles. In 38 states, an individual can lose their driver's license if they cannot afford to pay their court debts, even for minor offenses like littering that have nothing to do with traffic safety. A valid driver's license is the single most important factor in getting and maintaining a job. I don't know why I did that. Residents with suspended licenses are even further burdened by not being able to fulfill daily responsibilities like caring for children, making doctor's appointments, getting to the grocery store, and commuting to work. Without a license, everything becomes more expensive. as individuals are forced to pay for rides just to tend to the necessities of living. The government is trapping people in a cycle of poverty, making it even more likely that they will ever pay back their court debt that led them to the suspension in the first place. Yeah, not just driving. Driver's licenses are often used, I'd say, in 95% of the situations as a primary form of identification. And they mentioned a lot of things here. Doctor's appointments. Let me see your license, your insurance cards. That's a question you'll get asked from time to time when they need to check everything. If you don't have a license, it's like, there's a lot of issues it causes. And then to make things worse, there's a law that's getting ready to go into effect that says it cannot just be a simple driver's license. It has to have this certain mark on it to verify that you are valid, again, it's an attempt to take rights away from people. But like I say, driver's licenses are so hugely important. So yeah, like I said, we're so spread out as a country, you almost need to be able to drive. There are buses, there are people who can give you a lift, but it's not a guarantee. Next, we have excessive mandatory minimum sentences. Yeah. Proactive police practices, such as stop and frisk and broken window policies, disproportionately target minority and low-income neighborhoods. Whether it is a vindictive federal persecution of a rural Native American family using medical marijuana, or state prosecution of an amount of marijuana that is legal within the city limits, mandatory minimum punishments for victimless crimes are disproportionately directed at people living in poverty. Such individuals are easy targets for overzealous prosecutors, unable to afford legal counsel, and aware of the catastrophic results of getting fired. People experiencing poverty lack the tools to effectively fight back. When someone is imprisoned for years or decades because of a victimless crime, the entire community suffers from the loss of a parent, sibling, co-worker, or employee. Because, like I said, mandatory minimum sentences. Excessive mandatory minimum sentences. So your first crime, you can be locked up for like so long. It's ridiculous. They listed, an amount of marijuana or medical marijuana. If you're not attacking anybody, if you just peacefully assume it, or you have a plant yourself that you're not really selling anything from, it's just for your own use, where are they hurting others? That is a victimless crime. But in this situation, the only victim is the individual getting harassed by law enforcement. Among the many tools prosecutors have to exact astonishing long prison sentences. Conspiracy drug laws are often misused to sentence those with little or no involvement in criminal activity, most often women who are the wives or sisters of suspects, to disproportionately harsh prison sentences. Women are frequently coerced under the threat of mandatory minimum sentences into testifying against their loved ones in exchange for a plea bargain, and those who are unable to provide information, no family members are sent, and those who are unable to provide information on family members are sent to prison for decades. Yeah. That's ridiculous. It is uncalled for. One thing that we know that happens in America, there is an unjust number of people behind bars for drug offenses. You know, they're not doing anything wrong, but having possessed it or use it themselves. Honestly, I don't even think selling it should be a crime. You know, as long as you're still being honest, permitted, you know, there's no violence, you should not be punished for that. But, you know, it don't matter. In America, it's all about that capitalism, baby. That money. How much money can we make? Next, we have wealth-based banishment that outlaws low-income housing. In a particularly cruel version of the NIMBY effect, not in my backyard, small towns in Arkansas and elsewhere prohibit the existence of homes within the city limits that are worth less than the arbitrary amount of money, sometimes $25,000, $15,000, or even $7,500. These ordinances have nothing to do with public health or safety, but are an ill-disguised attempt to drive people experiencing poverty out of what modest shelter they have. These discriminatory laws banishing manufactured homes can result in already burdened individuals becoming homeless once they lose the only housing available to them. Regulations to ensure that homes have potable water, safe sewage disposal, electricity, and functioning heat make sense. Regulations that use money as a proxy for these necessities are merely another form of wealth-based discrimination. So again, we have another example of attacking the poor. You know, it's like, oh, we should do things, except not in my own backyard. You know, NIMBY, as they said. These are things that should be taken care of, just not here. It's like, how can you all see yourself as being good people when you're willing to have things taken away from poor individuals? I'll tell you what, if you do those kind of things and you believe you're a Christian, you're not going to heaven. It's been quoted over and over, but yeah. A rich man will have an easier time getting through the eye of a needle, or a camel will have an easier time getting through the eye of a needle than a rich man getting into heaven. So essentially, no, wealth and greed, if you use those, no. And then, to make it even worse, you're hurting others by taking away any help they have, anything they have to protect themselves. It's ridiculous. Private probation abuses. As our justice system gets more and more privatized, private probation companies have become one of the leading culprits for violating constitutional rights. The number of people on probation or parole is now higher than ever, and hundreds of thousands of individuals report to a private probation company. Counties are laying off their public probation officers and allowing private companies to earn profits from the citizenry. Too often, these private companies do not provide needed rehabilitation services, such as help locating jobs or housing, and instead they threaten probationers with jail to squeeze out exorbitant probation fees. Such practices destabilize housing, employment, and family relationships, and result in thousands of people going to jail simply because they are too poor to pay the company. Again, it's, attacks on the poor, on the struggling. Next one they have here, parking tickets to debtors' prison. Across the country, thousands of people are unconstitutionally jailed simply for being poor. States pile on fines and fees even when it is clear the person is simply too poor to pay. The Supreme Court has repeatedly held that someone cannot be punished for being poor. So thus, we don't technically have debtors' prisons. If a person genuinely cannot pay a debt to the state, then the state must find an alternative solution, such as community service, a payment plan, or a reduction in the fine itself. Nevertheless, many states ignore long-standing constitutional precedent and jail people for fines they cannot pay, resulting in modern-day debtors' prisons. The collateral damage to employment, child care, or education makes debtors' prisons a tremendous and unconstitutional barrier to climbing out of the cycle of poverty. So yeah. Again, attacks on the poor. And the last one they have listed here, sex offense registration laws. Almost every state has a sex offense registration law that leads to homelessness and unemployment, increasing the risk factors that can lead to recidivism. More and more evidence is pointing to the conclusion that excessively punitive sex offense registration laws impose draconian lifelong punishments on thousands of people who pose no risk. An estimated 900,000 individuals are on state registries, from those who committed offenses decades ago to Romeo and Juliet sexual encounters between teenagers. State laws that prohibit those convicted of a sex offense from living or working near a school or daycare, even if their offense had nothing to do with a child, drive people out of towns and cities and away from employment, family, and community support. One of their clients is forced to live under a bridge rather than with his wife or brother because their homes are both within a massive zone of exclusion, as is 80% of the entire city. So, yeah, it does happen that these laws are often used unjustly against some people. The Romeo Juliet laws, I know for a fact, happened. I knew somebody. Once he turned 18, the parents of, the person he was with used sexual offense registration laws against him. And it ended up forcing him to register as a sex offender. It's a sticky situation. Yes, there are some that do need to be registered, that we do need to know where they are, but others, no. Seriously. Some of it can be used very unjustly. And those who committed offenses decades ago, yeah, sometimes it's a one-time act. And I think if you have shown good behavior since, you should have some of your rights restored. Because you don't deserve lifelong pushback because of one mistake, one thing you did wrong. But yeah, the Romeo and Juliet things do happen. I've known that personally. I've known people who have been punished for that kind of situation myself, so. But yeah. And then we have a final site I've dug up here. They talk about the use of some unjust laws and it's understanding how some of it is historical. Like I was telling you earlier here in the video, we still suffer from the effects of intentional segregated redlining. We do. Although redlining itself is no longer legal, the effects from the time of it can still exist and just pin people down. I mean, one of the worst moments, some of the worst moments in history, the Tulsa Massacre. You had a growing neighborhood of African Americans. There was part of the white population who thought, no, that shouldn't be happening. And everything went to shit after they started attacking and burning the African American neighborhoods. the particular neighborhood. Black Wall Street, I think is what it was called. Because they were surviving, they were actually thriving. The neighborhood was growing, is getting better and better. Instead of saying, no, this shouldn't happen, and trying to make an example of it, instead it was buried in history. And for a long time, only a minimal amount of people really knew about it. And like I said, it's not just African Americans, Latin Americans, Asian Americans. There are all things that were unjustly done to these people. The marijuana laws, affected both Latin Americans and African Americans. Shoot, World War II, the Asian Americans ended up being locked up because many people feared that, they might be Japanese and handing off information, even though the majority of them were just trying to live their lives as people, as Americans. It wasn't, they weren't spies or anything like that. Now, that's not to say there weren't some here or there that maybe contributed, but the great majority, no. They were Americans trying to live their lives. But to kind of close out, there are unjust laws. Laws that honestly you should feel you have a right to push back against. Now, saying that, I want to repeat, be willing to accept the punishment, as Dr. King said, because you want something that would appeal to the conscience of people of the country. We need laws that truly serve a purpose and are not just there to attack people as part of a political ploy. But anyway, we'll go ahead and end this episode there. As always, educate thyself, think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I'll be putting my links in the description box below the video. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, later.